All right, Visi, today we're talking about 21st century education. I want to throw it back first. I want to talk about your education, how you learned growing up.
I suppose in the classical way. So I went to school like everybody else. You go to school, then you finish. After you finish, you get a job. And after you get a job, you kind of go, well, something is wrong with this picture. I'm not sure if I've got the right skills. And then you try to go back and start relearning. And one of the things you realize as you start learning is that actually learning is not a constant concept. You don't learn and then apply. As you apply, you're learning. And as you're learning, you're applying. So I think that's kind of how the picture is changing now. And I think that's where sort of South African education needs to start going.
Tell me about that relearning process. It seems to me like that specific thing is something that really discourages people. They don't know what to do when they hit that relearning kind of fork in the road. What do you do when you get there?
Well, I mean, I think a part of the problem is sort of the mental perspective and disposition we've taken to the learning question. So what we've done in South Africa is we've gone, and it's not a South African thing. I mean, I think it's a global challenge. Is you learn to pass, and you'll hear often, even in business schools, you're finding it today, where learners will ask the lecturer about, is this in the exam? And that speaks to sort of the disposition we've taken to the education and the learning, which is I learn to pass, and I want to know what's in the exam so I can learn that, so I can answer that question, so I can move on. Learning in the new world is about learning to know so that you don't need to know what you know. And this is where it becomes really complex. When you know what you know, it means you haven't learned it yet, because it means it's still conscious in your mind. It's when you start using it, not knowing that you've learned it, that it becomes internalized in you. That's really when you've learned. And that's why this relearning thing has become so important. The world we live in is changing really fast. I mean, in 1960, the amount of computing power Neil Armstrong had to send him to the moon was less than the amount of computing power you have in your cell phone right now. Right? And he yet created one of the greatest feats of the 20th century. So the world has changed, and if it has, so too do how we need to approach the learning process and understand that there's actually no such thing as a complete. There's no pass anymore. The pass is every day. It's a perpetual pursuit, and you're always looking to get better.
It's interesting you said in your talk that South Africans realize that change is happening, but they're almost a little bit complacent when it comes to change. How do we start change when it comes to education in this country?
So I think one of the things in South Africa is we think we are sort of shielded from the challenges of the world and the rest of the change. And so instead of driving it, we're rather recipients of it. And we're really good at leapfrogging, so a change will happen now and we'll adapt to it. And then there'll be minor changes over the next 5 years and we're cool with those, and then we'll do a big change again in 5 years. So we just leapfrog these technological changes that are happening. I think the role of education today, and if you look at what, for instance, the Gauteng government is doing, more specifically the Gauteng Education Department, is they're finally beginning to get the message that you don't need to deliver the physical textbook for the learner for him to learn. If you actually gave him a tablet and you gave him access to the internet, well, he could not only learn and download the content he also wanted, he could also get exposure to other bits of content around the world. So, there's an old adage now in the internet that the amount of data that's being put on the internet every 2 hours is more than the amount of data that existed on the internet for the entire internet pre-2010. Every 2 hours we're creating more data than has ever been on the internet pre-2010. That's the rate at which new information is going up, right? So we're doing this video, it's going to go live. And the minute it goes live, somebody will watch it, they'll share it, but then they'll be watching 5, 6 other things. That's the rate at which content is being produced, knowledge is being produced, and therefore learning needs to happen. If that is the case, then how we're approaching it needs to change. And I think that we're kind of getting the grab of it now.
Now, I think the problem is parents and teachers went through the very traditional way of learning, and they're thinking, how do we evaluate this? How do we evaluate this new space of learning when there are no exams? There's no physical thing that says, hey, I know this, I memorized it, I'm going to write it down. How do we now look at what you're learning?
So that's a great question, and the answer is that the learning has to be applied and experiential rather than rote. And rote says, I've learned something, you ask me a question, I answer, and based on variation to the answer you had in the script, you mark me. So if I ask 60% what you had, I get a 60% pass, I'm a C learner, right? In the new world, that's not what is needed now. Now it's about, well, you've learned. Show us how you use it and how you apply it. So if I'm sitting in a chemical sciences class, for instance, it's about whether or not I can do something with the knowledge I'm acquiring and learning about the period tables and what I can do with that knowledge, rather than whether or not I can tell you where iron is sitting on the periodic tables. If I'm sitting in mathematics, for instance, it's about what I can do with the theory of Pythagoras, rather than whether or not I can recite what the theory of Pythagoras is and solve an equation using it. So it's becoming a lot more experiential. It's becoming a lot more output based, and it's becoming a whole lot more about what you can do with the knowledge rather than the fact that you've got the knowledge.
Now, is there something that government can do to speed up this process and get this experiential learning into the classrooms any faster, or is it something that's just going to happen naturally?
So I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I think government has to intervene to a certain extent, but I also think as citizens and private companies, we need to play our role. But if there's a singular thing the government can do, make the internet available much faster, far more ubiquitously, much cheaper. You see, the internet changes lives, you see, and if you make it available far more ubiquitously, it's happening right now in Tshwane and Gauteng, for instance, where there's free Wi-Fi in the entire city of Tshwane. And every citizen is entitled to a batch of free Wi-Fi because they've adjusted to the fact that if you have free internet, it actually changes the social strata of a community. People are able to communicate, send messages, communicate with other people in parts of the world, and download knowledge as well. So if there's anything government needs to do, just make the internet available much cheaper, much faster. And I think when that happens, you'll find private role players who will then make the educational content available, who will then make the rest of the platforms available. We own an interesting business in Kenya called Kitabu. And essentially what that business does is it has taken the curriculum of the Kenyan government and has made it available over the internet. And we're trialing it now, but of course if it works, it'll fundamentally change the future and how we see the future. This is where learning is going. And understand, by the way, it's just one quick point, that the accreditation process we used to go to generate knowledge kind of doesn't work anymore now, right? So when you're generating the knowledge, you then have to apply it rather than just generate it and have it. And I think that's the big shift that education institutions have to make.
Now, we're speaking about educational institutions, but what about businesses? It seems like we have a whole workforce of people who have learned traditionally. We have young people coming in who have different ways of learning. Should businesses be looking at getting their employees to almost relearn and get on this the technological way?
They should, but I suspect they won't. I think they won't because they've got what is in their minds real life pressures. So they've got to deal with a receding economy. They've got to deal with massive fluctuations in the currency. They've got to deal with a growing unemployment rate. They've got to deal with a greater distance between capital and labor. Those are real issues that business is dealing with. And I suspect that continuous learning is not something business is thinking about. What I think will happen, this is my own natural proclivity, is that entrepreneurs will naturally emerge. They will create the organization of the future, a lot more efficient than the organization of the past. And the old state businesses will be forced to compete. Just as an example, so in our own firm, for instance, we run on a complete Google platform. 10 years ago, you couldn't run on a Google platform. It was unheard of. You certainly wouldn't store information up on the cloud where people can access it from the comfort of their home because, what happens if they access the wrong information and security and the rest of it? What you're seeing now more and more is a business's ability to say, actually, we can just get the applications and use them. Then why do we need to go native and create them and have our own and have the code written and it's sitting there and try to write it down in our balance sheet rather than just have it available? So it's already happening. And businesses themselves are being forced to adapt. So entrepreneurs like myself are going, I can do more with less. And if I disrupt, it'll force the bigger businesses to go, I now need a caliber of person that's able to operate in a disruptive environment.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about Googaloo, and you were speaking about it
Yeah.
in your presentation. Tell me what your experience was like in Sri Lanka when you saw them rolling out Googaloo.
I mean, it's almost as if I actually imagine it must have been, it certainly felt to me like what it must have felt like, I think, when somebody heard that Neil Armstrong had just landed on the moon or that Martin Luther King had just been shot. I think it's a time in history that is a big tick, and it's not a blip in the system. It's going to fundamentally change the system. Clearly, when it becomes ubiquitous, and it will, because they've got the resources to roll it out, I think it's going to fundamentally transform globalization. It's going to change communication. It's going to really, really increase the access to internet and technology. And that means that even in this learning world, the things we've learned, we're going to have to unlearn to learn a new way of working. I think it's interesting, my daughter doesn't know how to read a magazine. So she's 3. And she doesn't know how to read her mother's Marie Claire. She doesn't know how to do it. But if you gave her a tablet, she's very good at closing an app and opening an app and playing a game and buying stuff. And she's really good. She's 3 years old. So she's more tech savvy on a single platform than she is on the magazine. If you give her the magazine, she thinks it's a broken tablet. So she's trying to swipe it. But the picture on the cover won't move. She's like, why is this thing not moving, right? So this is, and that's a bit of an odd example, but it speaks to the change that's happened and how that change is going to continue to influence us in this new world.
Now, for people who haven't heard about Googaloo, can you briefly explain to us what it is and how you anticipate it's going to disrupt the telecom market?
So it's very simple. It's Google taking up a whole host of balloons, attaching to those balloons satellite, and through that satellite, they have satellite communication. You'll get a phone with a Google SIM card, and instead of your SIM card connecting to a fixed tower built by a mobile telecommunications provider, it'll connect directly to the satellite, and you'll be able to communicate. What that means is the more satellite they have, and it's a fraction of the cost to develop and put a satellite in the sky than it is to put an actual fixed tower. One, two, because it's a moving target, it means that they can move it to where there is a greater concentration of communication, which means you don't have a break in communication. So you know that if you try to call somebody at peak hour traffic, the line's really poor because everybody's sitting in traffic trying to access the same portal of communication. And what the Google Loom will allow them to do is to make those resources available as and when they're required, and then disperse them again as and when they're not required. So it is a fundamental revolution about how we've thought about the process of communication. And I'm really excited to see what it's going to do specifically in the African continent, when you no longer have to lay fiber or build fixed towers, but can rather have a communication network available as and when you need it.
Fusi, thank you very much for chatting with us. Before I let you go, can you give me the one tip, the one recommendation you have for South Africans who need to change with the times? What would you tell them?
Just do it. Just do it. If you want to survive and you want to be an employee of the future, you want to have the skills for the future, just don't hop on about it. Just get on the bandwagon and start doing it. And one very quick thing. The change we're experiencing, I want to say it again, is not a blip in the system. It will do to humanity what electricity did for humanity. Pre-electricity, everything used to work, and at 6 o'clock when it turned dark, everybody would shut shop. When electricity happened, you had the advent of 24-hour manufacturing, right? What's happening right now will do exactly the same thing for humanity. And if you think it's a change and it's going to pass, it's not a fad. It will not pass. It's here to stay.